Hi, and welcome back to our Flourish webinars. We're back from our summer break and the first session again, and we're kicking off today with a session on the power of text in data viz. Today's host is Simona. She's a content specialist at Flourish, and I'm Vanessa, and I'm a data viz specialist. And now over to Simona.
Hey, hi everyone. It's so nice to see so many of you here today. We're back from our summer break and are very happy to welcome you to our renewed Flourish webinars. Starting with one of mine favorite topics when it comes to data visualization, which is the role of text in this kind of like world of data viz. Today's session will be a little bit of theory, although I should start by saying that this is a beginner-friendly session. So for those of you who have little to no experience with data viz, this is a great session for you. And for those of you who are more experienced, maybe some of those things that we will mention today will kind of serve as a refresher. But we will focusing on titles, a little bit of just design principles covering very basics. We will cover things like direct labels, legends, some other tips, and of course, we will finish with some Flourish news. Without further ado, let's get started with the role of text in data visualization. I would like to start by basically showing you this chart. This is a column chart, just a generic, standard visualization. But basically, one thing that I would like to ask you is basically for you to see, to try to imagine what this chart actually represents. Are we looking at change over time? Are we looking at revenue? Are we looking at population? What are we looking at? Why is this last column colored in pink, for example, etc.? The idea here is that basically without the text on this chart, you're unable to find any additional context that will actually help us interpret what are we seeing on screen. Without having things like a title, without having things like labels, axes, etc., basically you can't actually realize what is the chart about, or nor your readers. And that's why text in data visualization is so important, because basically every single thing that you see on the screen without the pink versus blue lines here is text. We have titles, we have a subtitle, we have a y-axis title, text, label, source, axis highlights, and of course, let's not forget our pop-ups. So that's why it's so important that you should definitely pay attention to your text in data visualization. And although often being overlooked or kind of ignored or left in the last minute, text is indeed one of the most crucial components that you can have in your charts. Moving on with the text in data visualization, the role of text could be summarized to a couple of bits and pieces. Obviously, it adds unparalleled context to your graphs, meaning that, as we saw in the chart just a couple of seconds ago, you actually can't get almost like little to no context without any text in your graphs. That, of course, doesn't mean that you need to kind of like overcrowd your visualizations or anything like this, but like achieving some sort of a balance is very important. Text also emphasizes significant points in the charts with the use of things like annotations, labels, axis highlights, which we will cover throughout this webinar. It shows information where readers need it. Obviously, when it comes to titles or when it comes to labels in pop-ups, for example, with Flourish, when you create an interactive graph, this is one of the biggest benefits that users can hover over and see additional information, which obviously would be great to be there when people need it most. And I know it sounds silly, but it just makes visualizations look nicer, because without text, it will be quite plain and probably wouldn't do its job as well as possible. So when it comes to writing compelling chart titles, there are obviously a couple of best practices. Obviously, for those of you who are working in the newsroom, or in the media space, you have some sort of like writing training and are just generally training to be good writers. But there are a couple of tips and tricks that anybody can follow, and this is what we will cover now. As you can see here, starting with a little bit of a practical example, this is actually a chart that Vanessa created for one of our recent blog posts. And we can see here that we are looking at global temperatures, and yeah, this is what we need, because actually what I would like you to focus on is not the chart itself, it's actually the title. And what this title does very well is that, first of all, it shows the key takeaway of the data. So for example, if you have 2 seconds to basically show your readers what are they seeing on screen, this is what should go into the title. And as we can see here, basically, the key takeaway is that the main focus are the last 2 decades, which, automatically brings my attention to this side of the chart. Basically, we can see that there have been temperature records for the last 20 years. So you can start seeing trends and kind of interpret the graph. And this is really important because at the end of the day, not everybody is good at reading charts and graphs. And although it's not the best idea to kind of like just rephrase your chart in your title, it is still a good idea to kind of show the key takeaway. And speaking about showing, not necessarily rephrasing, another good part is that the less important information is in the footer. It's not, it's not actually in the title here, which will make the visualization a bit crowded, a little bit kind of, imagine that this sentence here at the bottom was being added here. It will just takes unnecessary space. Instead, this footer note is designed especially for people who are very keen on learning more about the graph, not just for those who are skimming through and trying to get the most of it as soon as possible. And last but not least, there is some sort of a visual hierarchy. In this example, in particular, the visual hierarchy that I'm pointing out is quite subtle. But what I mean by that is that basically the title of our chart, which is the most important one, and it shows the key takeaway of the data, has a bigger text than the subtitle, and it's in bold, which means that like subconsciously, my eyes will obviously focus on the biggest and boldest text in the chart first, and then they will hover over the subtitle, then they will go to the source, to the axes, and etc., etc. And if I can summarize the importance of the title in your charts, I would say this: your chart's title is your elevator pitch. It basically shows the key takeaway without delving into too much detail, but it also kind of like gives some sort of a reason why the reader should care about what they see in your visualization and why your visualization matters. And of course, without delving into too much detail is also a crucial aspect, because at the end of the day, we also need to provide our readers with some sort of space to draw their own conclusions. So if you can basically kind of think of your title in any sort of shape or form, think about it as an elevator pitch. Here are some additional considerations for a compelling title. Now, when it comes to length, data visualization experts usually recommend titles between 6 to 12 words for optimal clarity, which is exactly what we saw in the previous example. The most kind of like non that important information should go into the footer or in the notes, etc., etc. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, but this is kind of the general practice. Then we go to praising. So for example, when you think about how would you say this, think about how would you say the key takeaway of your data to a friend, or how would you say it out loud? I, for example, struggle a lot with this. So if you remember the first example that we showed with the column chart, it was about UK house sales, and the key takeaway of the data is that the house sales have actually dropped in the last 10 years. However, if I was writing this title, like I will basically manually start thinking 2023, so less house sales than blah, 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 etc., etc., which will kind of like be true, but it'd be a long-winded title. And it will be much less effective if I just say lowest house sales since 2012 or something. So this is quite important, and just like maybe whenever you're writing something, even a chart title, think about obviously how it would sound out loud, or if someone else explains your key takeaway to somebody else. A third tip, which is something that we love in Flourish as a practice, is the use of color in your headers. We even have a name, actually, this kind of colors in your headers. We call it a Riley legend, named after Flourish alumna, Catherine Riley, who basically created this very cool feature in Flourish, which kind of basically allows us to use colors in the header instead of a traditional legend, which is very cool, very nice practice, and lots of media organizations, newsrooms, and kind of data journalists already go with this option as opposed to having this legend. So if you're ever interested to learn more about this, you can always take a look at our blog and see. Probably you will spot these kind of coloring in our header very, very often. And of course, the best part is that you can do this in Flourish very, very easily. And last but not least, I just want to finish by focusing on visual hierarchy. As mentioned, this is a design principle which kind of states that the most important information should always be presented in the boldest and in the biggest text. And I'm pretty sure that this is something that you've all seen before, which is you will read this first, and then your eyes come here, and then they might wander around here or there. And at some point, you might actually read this final sentence. And of course, this is what the visual hierarchy, when you're designing anything, because data visualization is a form of design in one way or another, basically you need to think about the visual hierarchy. What do you want your readers to see first? What is the most important information, and how is the best way for you to present this? I am not a designer, but luckily Canva have come to the rescue, and they have an absolutely amazing and very detailed guide to visual hierarchy. So if you're ever interested to learn more about this and are generally curious, please do look at their guide. As last kind of a tip when it comes to titles, you can see here, of course, like this is again just our colors in headers, basically. Yeah. Anyway, as a last tip, what I would like to focus on is just the use of the typography in your data visualizations. I think this is also a design principle that just like goes a long way when it comes to anything really, whether it's a poster or like a cover or a data visualization in our case, but aim to not use as many fonts. So for example, a general practice will be using 2, maximum 3 fonts in your charts, because even though we have like just a simple line chart with just 2 lines, things tend to get quite busy if we're suddenly having, for example, this annotation here with a different font. If we have different fonts in the footers and our notes are are using a different typography, if the subtitle has this like difficult to read font, etc., just things become a little bit crowded. So for example, what we do in Flourish, when we create visualizations for our blog, for example, we use 1 font for our titles, which is Lato, and 1 font for our subtitle, which is Source Sans Pro. And of course, in Flourish, it's actually a little bit tricky to go absolutely crazy with the fonts, because everything within your charts, such as the axis labels and titles, for example, are kind of having adopting the default layout font that you would choose within Flourish. However, of course, you can manually change the fonts that you use for your headers. So just keep this in mind as a best practice. Moving on with our second part of our webinar, which is how and when to choose direct labels over legends. First of all, I would like to start with what is the difference between a standard legend and direct labels. So as you can see here on the left, we have a line chart, and basically the standard legend is just color swatches followed by a piece of text that basically represents different parts of our chart. For example, now we know that the lightest of blue is kind of like series 1, then we are going to series 2 and series 3, etc. in one way or another, sometimes obviously these kind of legends are absolutely sufficient and enough on their own, especially if you don't have lots of kind of like colors, legend swatches, etc. However, you will see, for example, in this case, where our colors are quite similar to each other, this, first of all, is not very accessibility friendly. And second of all, it's just a little bit complicated to get because I need to strain my eyes. I need to kind of like follow some weird eye movements in order for me to interpret, oh, okay, this is series 3, this is series 2, etc., etc. On the other hand, direct labels actually spare us from having to move our eyes constantly up and down or left and right or etc., regardless, like depending on when your legend is positioned. So in this way, I can much easily understand, oh, okay, this is series 1, this is what I represent, this is series 3, this is what it represents, etc. And instead of me trying to figure out which line is which, I can actually focus much easier on the trends and the patterns that I actually see in the line chart. So as a rule of thumb, whenever possible, do name things directly. Because if you remember in one of my previous slides, basically you can you could see that it's really important for you to provide the information where the readers needs it most, and in this case we need it right next to our line. Here is an actual example within Flourish. This is an area chart that basically showcase the number of unicorn companies created over time. And okay, here we have a couple of, how many do we have? 7 different colors, 7 different series. So in order for me to kind of understand what am I looking at, what is media and entertainment or versus enterprise tech, etc., etc., your eyes will basically have to do the following movement. So it's like going from this part of the chart, remembering the color, then going back up here to the legend. And by the time you just try to interpret the chart, it's just a bit confusing and complicated, especially when we have a lot of numbers, especially when we have like stacked area chart, for example, where some of the series are a bit squished. It just becomes a little bit complicated. And if I have to give an example from our day-to-day lives, it's almost like going into a shop, browsing, really liking a certain product, for example, I don't know, a chair or a table, and instead of having the price right next to the item, you basically need to go back all the way to the entry of the shop to see the price list at the front, for example. By the time you come back to your item, probably you already forgot how much it costs, etc., etc. So it is a little bit, it is asking a little bit too much sometimes from your reader. In comparison, here is the simple, more kind of like, just beautiful solution, which is putting labels on lines. And right now I can see, oh, okay, this part, my teal color represents insurance. This part represents consumer and retail, etc. And for example, with colors that are relatively similar to each other, like blue and like our blue and our purple, you can actually make a much better distinguish between the two series. To continue with basically direct labeling, obviously what I just showed you is available within the Flourish area and line charts. You have a setting that basically allows you to switch from a legend to labels on lines. However, you can actually do this manually in Flourish as well, which is with the use of annotations. We are very excited to talk about annotations because just recently we launched kind of like new curved annotations within Flourish, and you can do all these kind of like beautiful things and add-ons to your visualizations within the Flourish story mode. So if you're ever interested in learning more, please do. I'm sure Vanessa will share the relevant links in the chat. But basically, annotations are a great use of text in your data visualizations. Why? Because first of all, they really point the user to the most important information of your data. And also they can share interesting facts that, for example, yeah, of course, you can put in a pop-up, but for example, if you're creating charts for social media or you're creating kind of like an auto-playing story, etc., annotations just to work a little bit better in certain instances. So for example, in this scatter plot, we can see a little note that basically is an interesting fact that's not necessarily visible through the data, but it says that, for example, Qatar produces much more CO2 emissions than other countries, etc., etc. And last but not least, one other thing that I really enjoy and I really like is within the scatter plot template as well. So for any scatter fan out there, I hopefully you're gonna like this. But basically, our template has a certain feature called selective labels. So for example, if you can imagine every single label displayed on this visualization, you would imagine that this part here with the smallest countries, etc., will be quite crowded. Most of the labels will probably be hidden for kind of readability purposes, etc. However, let's say that I really need the Seychelles displayed here as opposed to Andorra. What I can do is I can enable the selective labels in the scatter plot, and when I go into story mode, I can literally click on the labels that I would like displayed, and my visualization will save the state I live in. So this is a really cool feature that I will definitely recommend for anybody that creates these kind of visualizations. And of course, I would like to emphasize that having legends is not by any means a wrong thing. Of course, when it comes to numerical data, of course, you need a legend. So for example, here, we can't actually get rid of the legend and, for example, choose labels on lies, or for example, emphasizing why the color Singapore is green and Qatar is red within my label or within my pop-up. Of course, in certain circumstances, you do need a legend. Before I move on, I will just give it a little break to ask Vanessa if we have any unanswered questions in the chat.
No, we're all good for now. Thank you.
Okay, perfect, sweet. Great. Well, in this case, I continue with a couple of other tips for readability when it comes to text. Now, you recognize this slide. This is not a bug. This is on purpose, but this is one of my first slides in today's presentation. So imagine if my whole presentation was basically kind of rotated at a 90 degrees. So whenever you have to read my slides, you kind of like need to, you know, like basically turn your heads, etc. This is not very good. And generally, I don't think none of us is basically kind of used to read. You don't even know how to read it. So it's almost like from bottom to top and then again, etc. It's just not great. And if this kind of thing is not something that we're used to seeing, then why do we need to do this in our data visualizations? This is one thing that we see a lot of times, which is that basically in order for users and data visualization practitioners and creators to kind of like have every single label visible on their visualization, they rotate their labels at a 90-degree angle. And while obviously there is always an exception to the rule, whenever possible, text should always be horizontal in your visualization. For very similar reasons to what we just said a couple of seconds ago, we kind of need to provide the reader with some sort of like mental bandwidth to kind of focus on the data, as opposed to kind of like trying to read your visualization or that like double check, wait, did I actually read this properly? Did I read this correctly? Because of course, with this example, you're kind of, it is self-explanatory that, okay, probably this is China, this is India, etc., because the words are smaller and shorter, sorry. But for example, if you're looking at a chart showcasing something a bit more kind of unusual, it will be a bit, it will take the user a bit longer to get the gist of your chart. Of course, in certain instances, it's okay to kind of rotate the label at a certain angle, which is fine. Here, it's a little bit better. And in Flourish, you have the option to rotate your axis ticks at between 90 degrees, 60, 45, 30, and 0. So obviously, this is a little bit better. And in certain instances, okay, like you can just leave your visualization the way it is. Of course, again, I'm saying that these are just guidelines. They're not like just a must. However, the best option will always be to have your axis ticks horizontal whenever possible. And as you can see here, for example, if we have left all these labels the same length as here, the United States will probably be hidden to ensure that Russia and India are possible to read. However, in many cases, the best and easiest option out there is to literally shorten your labels. And this is exactly what we've done here. And for example, Of course, mentioning 10 times already that there are exceptions to the rules. There is one kind of like very, very accepted exception, which is the y-axis title. Whenever it comes to y-axis titles, it is generally accepted for you to have your label horizontal vertical, but this is obviously, you know, like when it comes to preserving some sort of space or some sort of width for the rest of your chart to be readable. However, of course, if you would like to follow best practices in Flourish, you have the option to position it at the top of your y-axis as well. And while we're talking about axes, I just wanted to kind of mention something that probably is quite, you know, self-explanatory, but obviously, you should kind of think about the use of text and what is the most important thing of your data, and you should use text like scarcely, although you know, I was just talking that you basically need to, it's a good practice to include annotations, etc., etc. But what I mean by this is that, for example, another thing that we see relatively often is that if someone has a line chart like this one, and they have an x-axis that basically shows change over time, they put an axis title of the x-axis saying year or date. These kind of things are quite obvious, so I will definitely use my text in the right places instead of basically stating the obvious, that this is obviously a year. Of course, by all means, if you're showing something that could be kind of interpreted in a wrong way or just needs a little bit more clarification, to use an x-axis title. But when it comes to years and dates, I think most of us are kind of aware what your chart basically showcases. And of course, the x-axis title should also always be horizontal. And one last example when it comes to turning people's heads, hopefully for the right reasons though, is this column chart. Basically here again, we have some column chart that has the 90-degree labels on our x-axis. Of course, in an ideal world, it would be great if all of our ticks and labels are like this within in a horizontal mode. However, obviously, this also comes with some repercussions. And in our case in particular, is that obviously right now, this is perfectly fine to look at because we're looking at this chart on a desktop. However, if we were to look at this visualization on our mobile phones, for example, I can actually show you. I will be using my actual story. Here, this is the same story. If we focus, maybe I'll just put it at the tablet mode. If we look at it at a normal desktop width, you can see that our labels are still kind of visible. However, if we preview it at a mobile width, you see that basically our labels here for the low income and for the middle income are actually being hidden in order for us to be able to read the lower middle income. And this happens sometimes. Obviously, it is, we live in a world that we should definitely think about a mobile first approach. So this is definitely not ideal. However, when these kind of things happen, perhaps there is an easier solution that's just around the corner. And within Flourish line bar and pie charts, this might be just to switch the chart type from a column to a bar chart, for example, which will basically allow us to have our labels still horizontally. However, if we preview it at a mobile width, what the visualization does is basically takes a little bit from the bar's length as opposed to hiding labels in order for the chart to become visible. And I am aware that not everything could be visualized in a different way. And of course, in an ideal world, every label will be wrappable, and hopefully we will be implementing this feature soon. However, you know, in certain circumstances, perhaps maybe all it takes is to switch from a column chart to a bar chart, for example. So definitely take this into consideration. As you can see here, if I open my visualization, what I'm referring to is this chart type section here, where from a bar chart, I can select a column chart instead. And as you can see, the result is instantaneous. So we are definitely supporters of switching to a different chart type as opposed to basically trying to position your labels in a horizontal layout, a vertical, sorry. I'm getting confused. Okay. Last but not least, we're actually running very, very quickly in today's webinar, but that's great. So we can spend a lot more time to kind of answer everybody's questions. But basically, one thing to remember when it comes to text in data visualization is to also format your numbers. So this is something that's kind of being overlooked quite often, but is very, very important. And again, is all about presenting information where it might be most useful. So for example, here, let's say that we have a connected dot plot that basically shows a revenue in thousands and in US dollars. Obviously, it will take me a little bit of time to kind of like visualize and kind of connect the dots honestly between what I've just read and what am I seeing on the chart. So for example, I will have to kind of like basically interpret what am I looking, the two colors, blah, 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 and then come back to the title and say, oh, what was I looking at? Of course, a bit better would be to kind of use, leave your axis title in the same way, but also kind of point the reader in the right direction by adding a prefix or a suffix, which is good. And of course, whenever it's like absolutely mandatory that the user knows that we're talking about a US dollar, for example, do leave this information in the title. Because, for example, if it's something quite straightforward and self-explanatory, for example, if you're creating a visualization for your organization and you're talking about annual revenue and you know that in your company, your default currency is always US dollar, again, similarly to what I just said about the axis titles, you don't have to state the obvious. Obviously, if your company uses US dollar always, there is no point of you emphasizing this. However, if, for example, you're creating a chart that's being valued in a different currency, such as like Australian dollar, it might be important for you to mention this. So that's why you should kind of, you have the space to do this in your title. However, the best way possible would definitely be to use a prefix and a suffix and use text sparsely when possible, and basically kind of execute, kind of leave yourself some space for the most important information, such as annotation, etc., without your chart becoming absolutely cluttered and busy. So definitely, it will be a great thing for you to explore different options. And also another thing that I just wanted to point out is that it's also a very good practice to kind of try and shorten your y-axis whenever possible. So for example, if you're talking about 8 billion, you can just kind of like put you don't have to put as many zeros as, you know, to basically disclose that you are talking about the billion. You can always use the suffix to kind of just write capital B or a billion with full length, regardless, depending on your branding guidelines. But there is always an option for you to kind of like make your visualization a little bit better, a little bit more understandable, and a little bit prettier. And for the people, probably the most observant out there, you would also spot something more within the grade section here, which is that we have reduced the number of ticks within this chart as in comparison to here and here. So for example, you can see that the ticks are at each 50, whereas here we have only 4 ticks, so it's at 100. And this is good as well, because sometimes, especially when, for example, your data is kind of like within very large thresholds. So for example, you're coming from 0 to 700 or something like this. It is really important for you to kind of emphasize even subtly that where the user should look and what are the important kind of like thresholds within your axes as well. And this is again something very, very easily achievable within Flourish. And yeah, I think we're almost at the end. I just want to say about the number formatting, if you're ever interested, since we are running a little bit early than expected, I can always, please do let me know in the chat, and we can always talk about this and how this is achieved within Flourish. But if not, I would like to basically just kind of sum up this presentation, because obviously it's a lot of information, it's a lot of little tips and tricks out there. So if you need to basically pay attention to only one slide, I would probably suggest that it's this one. But basically, when it comes to key takeaways, I would always say the following. You should always use your title to reveal the most important information in your chart. I think for the data visualization world, spoilers are okay within the title. You should also, at the same time, keep it clear and to the point. Definitely hard to kind of like get your head around in the beginning, but obviously with time and with practice, all these kind of things start to become natural and quite ordinary. So although these two might be contradictory for you at the moment, it will definitely become easier in the future. When it comes to visual hierarchy, the most important information should always be in the largest and in the boldest text, as we have done here, for example, with our title on this slide. Color is also a helpful tool for creating visual contrast. So, of course, yeah, you can always emphasize it, whether it's in your header, whether it's in your subtitle, or you decide to do color overrides within Flourish, etc. This is really, really great tip. When it comes to labels and legends, basically just remember you need to show the information when the readers needs it most, aka position labels as closely to the graph as possible. This minimizes eye movement, which makes the chart easier to interpret and basically read as well. Annotations. Annotations are your best friends. They can be used anywhere. They can be used in our 3D map. They can be used in our line charts, bar charts, pie charts. It's just great and nice to use annotations whenever possible, so that you can kind of share little grains of interesting facts with your readers, or really emphasize the attention to a particular outlier of your chart, for example. Text should be horizontal when possible. I like to joke that you should turn people's heads, but for the right reasons. So if people are in awe of your data visualization skills, that's great. But if you kind of like force them to read things with the rotated neck, maybe that's not that ideal. Following this, basically switching chart types is sometimes a better alternative than rotating labels. And if even this is not basically possible, potentially another alternative might be for you to kind of seek something like adding an annotation to point out something that's particularly important, or the selective labels within the scatter plot, or even the information within the pop-ups, of course, if you're creating an interactive chart. And last but not least, consider the readability of large figures and format numbers effectively, because it will definitely be easier for someone to grasp that you're talking about 7 billion 0.5 as opposed to writing 7503, etc., etc. And if you would like to be precise and like very specific, especially when it comes to numbers, because obviously this is quite important in certain circumstances, again, utilize the pop-ups of every point to basically specify the biggest number, but don't overcrowd your axes. And I think this is basically the end of my session. And maybe leave it over to you, Vanessa, for some Flourish news.
Yes, so while we were on our webinar break, a lot of exciting new things happened. So for example, just a couple of weeks ago, we published a blog on the interactive SVG template, which you can use to turn static SVGs to interactive and engaging experiences and embed them on your website, for example, or put them into Canva presentations. Like Simona's already mentioned, curved annotations are new, and there's also a link to the blog again if you want to check out how they work and what other annotation styles are available. And also numeric coloring is now available in the table template. And there were a few other things that happened. And if you want to stay up to date with all the new things, just check our changelog. And we'll be back in just under a month with another webinar, this time on the topic of booster reporting with data visualization, a toolkit for journalists. It will be on the 10th of October, again, at the same time. And the session is designed for journalists, but also for anyone who showcases data daily. And you can use this link to register, and we'll also get emails about it as well. And if you, here are some resources that Simona mentioned and used for her webinar. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper, just check them out. And as always, just reach out if you have any questions at flourish-webinar@canva.com for webinar-specific questions, or at hello@Flourish Studio for anything else. And also follow us on social media to stay up to date and get notified when something new comes out, like a blog, or when our next, when you can sign up for the next webinar and all these things. So thank you so much for joining. Like already mentioned, this was recorded, and you will also get the slides in a couple of days via email. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. And also you can find the recording then on our YouTube channel. And if you want to look at some previous recordings, they're all there as well if you missed the previous webinar. And yeah, thank you so much, and see you next time.